بسم الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه واتبع هداه إلى يوم الدين. وبعد, it's a pleasure and honor to have our dear close friend Dr. Ahmed Mohamed to visit the Islamic Center of Davis, inshallah, on this blessed night, the night of Friday. And we hope, inshallah, that his words will be beneficial for every and each one of us who are here and who are listening on the online, inshallah. Dr. Ahmed, he holds a master and PhD in biology. So he's an official doctor, not like us, okay? The ones who carry PhD, but they're not real doctors. He is a real one. So inshallah, if you have any question, we could do counseling afterward, inshallah, the Sheikh, for free. That's one. Inshallah. And the Sheikh holds a master's degree in Islamic studies from the Islamic University of Minnesota and working on his PhD, inshallah, in Islamic study. And the topic today is very important, especially as we said in the khutbah last Friday, when we're talking to non-Muslims or people with different faith or different beliefs, we have to understand concept of things before we speak about it. So we hope, inshallah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yujri al-haqqa ala lisanihi wa qalbih, and things become clear today to us, inshallah, and we could benefit from his talk. So I don't want to take much of his time, inshallah. I would let the Shaykh start, inshallah. Give him your attention, and hopefully, inshallah, the Shaykh could give you some time at the end for any questions if you have, or any clarification that you want to ask, inshallah. جزاكم الله خيرا. تفضل شيخنا مشكورا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. صلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. جزاكم الله خير for introduction. I should like to thank Sheikh Ammar and Sheikh Ahmed for inviting me in Sydney Institute. جزاهم الله خير for this invitation. Which reminds me, I have a few flyers in front of here because they actually had started an intensive one-year introduction course. And it's pretty impressive, actually. In 1 year, you're covering about 17 subjects, which are the basics of different fields in Islamic studies. So I do encourage you, if you're really interested, and I do encourage, even if you're not interested, to try it out. Because the least you get is a reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned, the reward or the virtue of those who had seek the knowledge, that you don't seek a path of knowledge except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitates a path for you to Jannah, but also that the angels lower down they lower their aim. Okay, now I have to whisper. No, it's good. So that the angels lower down their wings as a sign of being pleased with the person who seeks knowledge. Now, that being said, I don't know what the Sheikh had mentioned in terms of a khutbah on Friday, but he was talking about non-Muslims and understanding their point of view. But to be honest, Darwinism is not, in the modern time that we live in, is not something that's pertaining non-Muslims only. But in reality, it's affecting the entire Muslim ummah, from the Eastern world or even to the Western individuals who live here. To the point that quite often some people are not happy. No, to the point that actually some people might feel that it can cause some sort of conflict with their own faith. So that being said, mashallah, I'm quite happy with the number of young individuals. I can tell a lot of the individuals are in college. I'm going to get a rough estimate. I'm sure everybody heard, obviously everybody heard of Darwinism one way or another. But actually, how many people have studied this in biology or... So you guys anybody in the biology department? Wow. طيب, alhamdulillah. All right, so with that being said, so I guess I'm going to have to up the talk a little bit because I wasn't quite sure if I'm going to put a lot of scientific aspects in it. So inshallah, hopefully a lot of you can understand some of the terminologies and jargons I'm using. But if I forget myself and I start mentioning things and getting a bit sciencey, then please stop and raise your hand, and I'll try to define certain terms. I might go a bit slow in the beginning, try to explain every every terminology as I go along. However, the reality is I will forget, and I do apologize because I am lacking sleep. I'm from the East Coast, and we are 3 hours ahead of you, so it's almost my bedtime. That's why I have a large cup of coffee in front of me. hopefully it will suffice me, inshallah. So I'm going to ask another question. So how many people in this room actually have a feeling that, or the impression that Darwinism is very well established in the science field? It's almost pretty much a fact. There's nothing to be like, just raise your hand. I just need to know, because we're gonna, okay, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, excellent, a quarter. Almost sitting here. Now, how many feel that Darwinism actually can be sort of can potentially affect their belief system, and that it cannot be reconciled with, I guess, Islam? So it's perfectly okay then? Harmonious with Islam? I should go home? No, come on, let's be honest over here, right? By the way, my talks are very interactive. I don't like talking for long. Besides, I don't want to fall asleep while I'm talking. So I will expect you to answer. If not, I will pick on you, right? I'll start pointing fingers. So in reality, do people actually feel that there's a bit of a contention, a conflict between Darwinism that potentially might affect their own belief, or everybody's okay, right? And everybody's okay, that's great. If not, then that's also fine too, because we're going to discuss those. But anyway, my objective is kind of to address that aspect of things. Because the way that Darwinism is actually being talked about in the public sphere, in the popular literature, in the popular media, is not exactly as it is when you talk about the academic circles. And that's, to be honest, that's the same thing in every scientific discovery that we make. If you ever read it, if you ever start reading, inshallah, first articles, first paper, our first resources, if you ever read a scientific article, you'll realize that the tone of the authors is quite a bit different than what is being placed on the news, right? So for example, in the article, it will tell you our results suggest this, our results indicate this, our results point to this, and then in the news, proven, this causes this, right? That way of advertising something really does have an effect. It almost ingrains into our minds, that this is something that is a fact, but also even how science is being, advertised or being propagated as a science or a tool of knowledge. And so inshallah, hopefully we're going to address all these things. But generally speaking, I kind of divided my talk into three parts. One is a basic definition, trying to define Darwinism. What we're talking about Darwinism over here, for the people who are not in the biology field. And there's a reason behind this, because we're going to also talk about, from that definition, some of the assumptions associated with it, which will move to a next point we're going to talk about, which is the current situation of Darwinism, or current state of Darwinism. And then the last point I'm going to talk about is, from Islamic perspective, how do Muslims deal with Darwinism, essentially. Now, the bulk of my talk will be the second point. And I have to be honest, this talk is supposed to last, I think, for about an hour, so we can leave at least about 15 minutes for questions, or 20 minutes, is not sufficient to address the entire thing. I would not be exaggerating if I can say you can actually design an entire course of at least about 5 to 6 classes, if not even more, discussing this topic in every single aspect, from the philosophy of science to the evolutionary biology aspect of it, to the genetic, to the molecular biology, to paleontology, to every single aspect of it. And so today, really, I'm not going to touch on all of these, but I'm going to try to point a few things, hopefully, that we could kind of relate or have a message being, hopefully, inshallah, given to you of what I'm trying to give. But it's just kind of a glimpse, almost like a snapshot of what we're going to be for the entire field. Hopefully, inshallah. So that being said, Darwinism, I've seen a few people raise their hand in biology. So what is Darwinism? Biology students, come on. What is Darwinism? Define Darwinism. I told you I'm going to ask you questions. It's not a pop quiz, don't worry. There's no failing or passing. Darwinism, what is Darwinism? Darwinism is evolution, right? Everybody agree? Yes? Wrong. No, not correct either. So we have to differentiate. Good thing that somebody asked this question, alhamdulillah, because there is a difference between evolution and Darwinism. Evolution just talks about change. This is what So you're not doing your job. So evolution is just change. That's all it is. Now, Darwinism is a theory discussing the mechanism of that change. Right? So there is a distinct difference. And this is important to mention because anytime if you ever start arguing with a person who adopts Darwinism, the first thing he'll throw back at you is, do you disagree with evolution? Right? No, not necessarily. The people who have, with the theory itself, problems with the theory, are not talking about evolution as a change, but they're talking about the mechanism that's being proposed. So those are two different things. They're not the same thing. So that being said, Darwinism is really a mechanism. So it's a theory that proposes a mechanism for the process itself of evolution, which is change. So essentially, it's a theory that answers the question, how does change occur? So we see change that occurs, that's evolution. The question is, how does it occur? This addresses, how did that happen? And so the most fundamental concept, the core concept of Darwinism, and when I'm talking about Darwinism over here, just to be clear, I'm talking about new Darwinism, right? It's also known as the modern synthesis. Don't worry about that. But if you ever read any popular book or culture or textbook in biology, when they talk about Darwinism, this is what they're talking about. They're not talking about the original theory that Darwin proposed, but this is a revised version of it. So it's called Neo-Darwinism or modern synthesis. So the core concept over the fundamental concept regarding evolution is that of one common ancestry, and the other one is natural selection. So those are two core concepts. I'm going to elaborate a bit more. But one can say that there are two components to Darwinism. Okay? One is more of an operational component, and the other one is a historical component. So the operational component is the change that occurs by natural selection, acting on trait variations, so differences, that are caused by genetic mutations. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that we all have different features around us. Is that right? There's variations among human beings, and those variations are caused by different gene sequences. So in any population, there is variations in genetics. What the theory is proposing is that natural selection can select specific traits based on the variations that happen or arise because of genetic mutations. Is that clear? Everyone know what mutation is? Good, excellent. All right. Now this is more of the operation aspect, so how it operates. You can also add in there something that's called genetic drift or genetic flow. Yes? All right. Mutation. All right, do you know what DNA is? What's your name? Mohamed. How old are you? 11. Do you know what DNA is? All right, it's that code in our cells that, I shouldn't say produces proteins because it can result in RNA, but roughly speaking, I'm going to be very kind of dirty about it. But it's a sequence that codes for other things. So whenever a change, so these things are usually copied in exact copies. Anytime a change happens, it's an error. That is called a mutation. Okay? Good question, Mohammed. Jazakumullah khair. All right, now the historical component aspect of it, so this is the operation. The historical aspect is talking about the ancestry of it. So ancestry, the ancestry, universal ancestry, which means that all the creation that we see in front of us, everything originates from the original cell, and the original cell results due to natural selection and mutations results in what is called the tree of life. So if you ever look at a classical textbook, they have these trees and the nodes, they have different organisms, species, and it all goes back to that universal first cell. And so essentially that tree kind of shows the original cell and then transitional different species, and they're gradual, they move through time until you reach the modern whatever you see. So basically that's the historical aspect of it. So you have the mechanism, and then you extrapolate that, say, okay, historically this is what we are predicting to happen. So essentially all life forms, they originate from a single common ancestor. So this is what Darwinism is talking about. So all organisms, they originate from a single and common ancestor, and it was natural selection acting on the existing genetic traits of the organisms and their offsprings, resulting in organisms with more suitable traits to survive and thrive. That's basically in a nutshell, okay? So all they're saying also is that these mutations, what it's advocating is that all these mutations that are happening are really beneficial. So that's the only way you can advance. So you have beneficial mutations that will result, like over time, they'll accumulate, and you'd have larger, bigger, more complex, more advanced organisms. Clear so far? All right, now I'm going to break this down to the assumptions. So I'm going to say the same thing, but I'm just going to put them in point form. What are the assumptions based on this theory? So the first assumption is that there's universal ancestry. Is that clear? You guys don't have to write. I'm going to make you memorize this. So the first assumption is there's multiple. I'm going to mention only 6. So universal ancestry. All organisms, all the creation originated from the single original cell. Okay. The second is that undirected, which means nobody's directing the mutations. It's not under control of anything. It's just random. Undirected, random mutations can result in novel, meaning new, advantageous traits that are transmitted vertically to the next generation. So it's a vertical transmission from father to offspring, from mother to offspring. Okay, so it's a vertical transmission. So a mutation happens in the parents. It gets transmitted to the offsprings. So that's called vertical transmission. So the second assumption is that it is undirected, random mutations that result in beneficial traits that are transmitted vertically. Okay? That's the second assumption. The third assumption is that these changes are gradual over time. It's not all of a sudden. Okay, you don't have these. So there's small little changes, one over the next, and it builds over time. And so they accumulate over time, which means that one can predict, based on this aspect, this assumption, you should be able to predict that there are transitional species from an ancestor to a more modern one. That makes sense though, right? Does that make sense to everybody? If I'm making gradual things, right, gradual changes, so logically speaking, I have the end result and I have the beginning. I should be able to see transitional forms from one to the next because they're gradual and slow. Because they happen through time, right? So one of the assumptions that Darwin had made, he said, so in the fossil records, we should be able to see those transitional organisms from one to the next. And quite often, usually their focus is about humans. And so they're talking like, their prediction is that from some sort of an ape-looking organism, ape-looking ancestor, that you should be able to see transitions all the way to the human. Which makes sense. You guys all agree? Okay. Now the fourth assumption is that this process allows increase in organization from simple to complex. Because one advantage over another advantage over another advantage, selected, all of a sudden you have these more complex things. And it's advantage because the more complex, the more things you're able to do, the better you survive, or the better your chances are for survival. Okay? I'm just reiterating the theory again, but I'm putting the assumption because all these are assumptions. Now what are we to the fifth or third? Fifth, okay. The fifth one is that present-day observation, right? Observation of, present-day observational data may be extrapolated as far back as one wishes. Because it's the same, right? We're talking about something that is continuous throughout time. So whatever we can see now here, and how it works, we can extrapolate and move all the way as far as we want. All right, that's the historical component of something. But it also allows the scientists, when they look at something, when they're analyzing something, it allows them to say, okay, it means in the past that this could be happened or whatever happened, so they can make connections. Now the last one, the sixth one, is that the assumption is that any similarities that you see between organism is due to what? Common descent. And any differences are due to what? Divergence. Okay? So which means that diverge from each other. So they have a common ancestor, similar comments, however they're different. And so they say, hey, listen, look, the similarities are because they have common ancestry, and the difference is because they diverged from each other, because that's why they're different. And yes, it's because of mutations. So those are the assumptions, okay? Now, this is the theory in general. And it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? No? One of the sisters saying no. Why not? Random is not subjective. That is true. But we're seeing natural selection over here as an environmental, stimulus. It would select for things that are advantageous. Not if we're looking if it's survival. Right? If the key thing is the survival of the organism and to allow it to reproduce, then anything that enables that is advantageous. Right? So, for example, eyesight. Compare a person who had development of eyesight compared to creatures that don't have eyesight. The ones who have eyesight are more likely to survive than ones that don't have sight. Right? So they tell you okay, this is why creatures had developed sight. That's something that is advantageous. But you have a good point, by the way. We're going to discuss that later. Okay? I'm going to mention that. Now I'm going to come to the second point, which is the current state of Darwinism. So I pose this as a question. So is Darwinism definitive? Right? Meaning that it's a fact, the truth that has been proven scientifically. Okay, what's your proof? I do this all the time, by the way. If you're going to say yes or no, I'm going to ask you why. So you're not going to get away from it. So is it a fact that has been proven scientifically? Which means that it's not definitive, nothing disagrees with it. It's a theory. So what does that mean? Probability, huh? You're in biology? You're in science? No. Hold on, what program are you in? Okay, that's why. All right, I'm going to need your help later on, inshallah. All right. Anthropology is good. They use a lot of philosophy, which is good. All right, do you guys know that a theory is the highest level that you can reach in science? It's pretty high up there, right? It's a theory. It's like, you start with a hypothesis. Once it's established and it's accepted, it becomes a theory. That's the highest level you can reach. So it's pretty well established, right? But still, my question holds, is it a fact that has been proven scientifically? Yes? Really? Oh no, you're thinking about null hypothesis. I understand. I know. So you have the null hypothesis, and so you either prove it or disprove it. But no, usually, most of the way it works is that you have a hypothesis and you're testing if it's true or not.
Right, but the evidence that you're finding in an experiment, it can only ever fail to disprove a hypothesis, not necessarily to prove that hypothesis is fact.
I know what they're teaching you in the textbook. But in all practical purposes, when science is being done, the way they look at it is that evidence supports the hypothesis. But you're right. Philosophically speaking, these evidence, what they do is they don't disprove the hypothesis. But if they don't disprove it, it indicates that it's not false. So for all purposes, it means that it must be right. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. So many Darwinian proponents, what they're doing right now is that they propagate in popular writing and popular media to the public that Darwinistic mechanism of evolution is undisputed, proven certainty, which means it's the truth and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Pretty much, right? Anytime you open a textbook, what do you see? How do they talk about it in a textbook? Guys who studied biology, how do they talk about Darwinism and evolution, mechanism of evolution in textbooks? As a matter of fact, when you look at National Geographic, when they talk about evolution, what do they talk about? The primitive man used to live on trees, right? From ancestral, ape-looking creatures. This is how they talk about it, right? It's more of a history story, and this is how it's being propagated. Am I right or wrong? Yes? And so this is what is being done. Now, I'm going to get a bit more into philosophy, but I'm going to mention something over here. Now, the reason that they do this, or many scientists or proponents of Darwinism, the reason they do this is because they adopt two things, okay? One is a worldview, a specific worldview, and the other one is a specific epistemological position. Now, worldview means how you believe the world is. It's more of a faith-based thing, okay? Your philosophy of how you view the world. In terms of epistemology is referring to the sources of knowledge. How do we attain knowledge? And I'm going to mention this quickly so you can understand whenever you're talking to a scientist and then you're trying to propose different theories, even among the scientific realm, why sometimes it almost feels like you're hitting a brick wall. Okay, so in terms of the first one, when we're talking about the view, their view of the world, their worldview, it's more of something that's called philosophical naturalism. Okay, now what this means is that it's a philosophical paradigm whereby everything can be explained in terms of natural causes. Okay, so physical matter is the only reality. Physical matter is the only reality. Everything can be explained in terms of matter and physical phenomena. And so the supernatural or the spiritual explanation is excluded or even discounted. Is that clear? So there's nothing but materialism. That is the reality and nothing but that. So this is how they view the entire world. Now when you combine that with their view of epistemology, is what they believe is the only way to attain knowledge. Okay, so this is something that they kind of coined scientism, and an MIT physicist, his name is Ian Hutchinson. He offers an interesting definition of scientism. He says it's science modeled on natural science, on the natural sciences, is the only source of real knowledge. Okay. So this is what they're saying. They're saying, so these, a lot of these proponents are saying that the only way you can understand and attain knowledge is via what? Science. Why? Because you can test it. You can sense it. You can retest it. And that retesting gives you confidence that this is the truth. Does it make sense? All right. Now, how's science? So this is called scientism. How's that different than science, by the way? Because it can get a bit confusing. How is scientism different than science? I saw a hand at the back. Is there a difference? Yes. Scientism, yes, it is the philosophy, but it's philosophy of how we acquire knowledge. Okay, science is the practice itself. So science is an activity that seeks to explore the world, of the natural world with established methodologies based on natural interpretations. Okay, that's science. But when you talk about scientism, you're saying that the only way we can find the truth or gain knowledge is through this process. Is that clear? All right. Now, once I mentioned this, you basically have two questions then, and then I kind of raise. I'm going to talk about. One, is Darwinism a proven scientific certainty? Okay. And two, is science the only source of real knowledge? Now, the first question can easily be answered if we address the second question. So the question over here we're going to talk about right now is science the only source of real knowledge, to attain knowledge? So I'm kind of addressing scientism itself. So this is a bit more of an epistemology. and hopefully, inshallah, I don't lose you guys. So I'm going to mention 4 things that discredit this idea that science is the only way to attain knowledge. I'm going to mention 4. There's multiple, but I'm going to mention 4, 4 quick ones. The first one is that statement in itself, that science is the only way to attain true knowledge, is a self-defeating statement. Why? You know what self-defeating means, right? All right. Because what? Because now they're making a statement, right? They're saying that knowledge can never be attained except through science, or science is the only way to attain knowledge. This is a fact. This is a truth. But can they prove that scientifically? Can they? No. So that almost like kind of defeats their own purpose. Is that right? The second reason why I'm saying no is that science in itself can never lead to certainty. Okay? Because of 2 main reasons. So science as a science, as a field, can never lead to certainty. You can never say this is 100% how it is. The first reason is sometimes called the problem of induction. Okay, so if you ever studied philosophy, this is kind of raised by Hume. And the problem of induction, you guys know what induction means? We have induction, deduction, and abduction. I'm going to try to simplify things. These are wait, you can explain. طيب, جزاك الله خير. He mentioned it in Arabic. All right. So induction, all it means is that you are making observations, okay? And based on these limited observations, you're making a conclusion about the remainder of things you did not observe. Is that clear? So I have a specimen in front of me. I'm studying that specimen. And based on what I see, what I observe, I'm going to make a conclusion that if I ever study other specimens, that this applies also to it. That is called induction. Exactly. Now, the problem of induction, because science builds its conclusion on limited observations, so it uses instances of what we have observed to make conclusions of what we did not observe. Okay? So deriving a conclusion from a limited data will not be certain. Because in the end, it's limited. All science is like that, right? We look at limited amount of things, we do experiments, 100, 200, whatever sample we have. In the end, it is limited. So whenever you have anything limited and you make a conclusion on it, it will never be certain. Why? Because there will always be new observations, because there can always be a new observation or a way of seeing things that will be at odds with your previous observation. Okay. Some people try to simplify it and kind of tell you, like, they call it the black swan problem. So if you look at swans, you see white swan, white swan, white swan, white swan, white swan, white swan. You make a conclusion that all swans are white. And then you travel to the East Coast, all of a sudden you see a black swan, right? And so this is why they tell you, you cannot, it's not certain. So this is, and to be honest, this is the beauty of science, right? This is the beauty of science. Why? Because it allows you to change, right? Whenever, it makes it very easy to advance, to revise, to change. Whenever you observe something, you can change it. But it also doesn't allow it to be concrete, that it faces, almost like, unmovable boulders, right? But rather, this is what makes science very interesting. New discoveries lead to new interesting theories. These theories can be tested in better theories. It's almost like, it's like a mental stimulation. And this is really the beauty of it. This is one of the things about it. So one, problem of induction. This is why science cannot be certain. The other reason is that the same set of observations can lead to different inferences. Meaning it can lead to different conclusions. All right? So we'll say that you have a sample and somebody observes something and says, hey, wait a second, I'm observing something here. I'm concluding it works this way. And then another person looks at it, he's like, no. He looks at the same set of things and he says, no, I think it works that way. Okay? Now, anytime you can interpret, anytime you have different interpretations or multiple interpretations of the same data, it indicates that these conclusions or models are not certain or definitive. Because how do you know then which one is true? Right? And then especially if you have a third and a fourth. Now the best thing you can do as a scientist is to say that this model works the best. Okay? That this model works the best. And we do have examples like that in a lot of the fields of science, especially if we talk about physics. Especially if our view of how things work, whether you talk about Newtonian physics or Einstein, right, relativity. Now these theories contradict each other of how they view the world in terms of calculations and everything, but yet, they're there. In some instances, it's better to use Newtonian physics, in other instances, better to use ones based on Einstein. But in the end, you cannot accept both, right? Both are not true at the same time. Nonetheless, this is what it means. Anytime you have multiple conclusions on the same observation, it tells you that you cannot you cannot say that this conclusion is definitive and true as opposed to the other one. Now that being said, the reality is, and a lot of biologists don't like to admit this, is that there are multiple groups of scientists that are coming together to declare what they're calling a dissent from Darwinism, right? Which means objection to Darwinism, and they're a large enough number to the point that there's actually I just ran I kind of came across this website. It's called The Third Way, right? And then kind of underneath it says evolution in the era of genomic and epigenetics, because they are not happy with the theory of Darwinism. They're saying that it's unable to explain the new things that we're observing in genomics, in epigenetics, and whatever the case is. And so they're trying to come up with their own theories. And the interesting thing is these are multiple individuals from different parts of the world. And what's even more fascinating is that these group of people are coming up with different theories, which now that means that there are other different theories that are coming up to interpret the same data that is being observed to put a mechanism that is different than Darwinism. And I'm going to mention a few kind of mechanisms that are kind of popular so far in the field. I don't have time to go into details about all of them, but just to mention some name, if you want to kind of write those. I'm going to mention why sometimes, or at least for a couple of them. For example, neo-Lamarckism. Okay, everybody who studied biology knows Lamarck, right? Anybody heard of Lamarck? So his theory was before Darwinism's theory, before Darwin himself. So his theory, Lamarck, he said essentially, is that no, we don't, it's not one original ancestor, it is multiple different ancestors, lineages, and they are environmental traits that we developed, okay, due to the environment that are transmitted. And he gives the example of the giraffe, right? If he needed to get something from the tree, it extended its neck, and so over generation, the neck kind of got longer and it got transmitted. Now this was thrown out the window, right? After Darwinism and quite a few years later on, it got thrown out. However, interestingly, it's coming back again as more of a refined model. And some of the proponents of that, that school of thought, the reason they're saying that actually there is some Lamarckism in what we see, based on something that's called epigenetics. Now I know this is a new term I'm proposing. So epigenetics, all this is talking about is that these are changes. I shouldn't say changes. They are markings on your DNA that are a result of the environment around you, your experiences. So something is called methylation, for example, right? Part of your DNA gets chemical groups added to it. What's interesting is that those changes ends up getting transmitted to the next generation. Okay? Now, there is no mutation that happened, no additions, no deletions, no substitutions. It just, a chemical group got added to it and it affects an expression. And that gets transmitted. Okay? Ironically, do you guys know how Darwin kind of developed his theory initially? There's a bird that's very famous. The finch, right? The birds. There was a paper published in 2014, okay? Let me quote it. 2014. So he saw these differences. So Darwin saw these differences and says, oh, it's straight, environmental, and then it's being proposed that it was genetic mutations that caused that drift. And now you have different species of finches that cannot copulate each other. But this paper, interesting, 2014, this is what it says. It says epigenetic changes are distinct and that they correlate with the evolutionary history of the Darwinians finches. It is possible that epigenetic changes contribute to the molecular basis of the evolution of Darwinian finches, which means that it's not exactly mutations that resulted in that, but it's more of epigenetics, which is a bit more of Lamarckian, right? I find that kind of a bit ironic. But anyway, you have the Lamarckian theory out there. The other one is something that's called Mendelian mutationism. Another name for it is evolutionally driven mutationism. And it's a combination between two ideas. The first is that change does not happen gradually, right? It happens all of a sudden in large amounts. But the second aspect that they adopt is that mutations tend to hold strict Darwinian line that all differentiation is good for the species, right? So mutations happen, but it's not gradual. So it's a bit different. And the reason they did that is because they're looking at the fossil records and they notice there's gaps and there's always periods of, different species arising and then extinct. Different species arising and then extinct. And so they said, listen, we don't see that gradual change. And so they say that change happens in mass and in large and in leaps. Okay, that's another theory. A third theory is symbiotic evolution. A fourth is evolution by self-organization. And these are all modern scholars. But, and I'm not telling you that they're popular, right? I'm not telling you that they're not being argued against. But my point over here is that any time you have different explanations, different conclusions, different mechanisms being built on the same set of observations, it tells you that this conclusion that we're talking about can never be definitive. Because if it was definitive and true, we should not be arguing about it. Is that right? It's very simple logic. Is that right? Okay. Now, the other reason that science cannot be the only reason of knowledge, the only way of attaining knowledge, is because science has limitations in what it can answer. Hands down, right? And this is something that even, you can find it in biology textbooks. So I'm going to quote, over here something from the Campbell the Campbell textbook, which is the classical textbook by Princeton Publications. You find most, colleges have it. It's either that or another, textbook, but a lot of them, they have the Princeton one, the Campbell one. And so it says over here, scientific inquiry is a powerful way to know nature, but there are limitations to the kind of questions it can answer. There we go, limitations. These limits are set by science's requirement that hypotheses be testable and falsifiable, and that observations and experimental results be repeatable. So this tells you right away, if you have a limit on something, it cannot be the only way to attain knowledge. That makes sense, right? All right. Now, the other reasons that I'm going to talk about, give you an example of how other limitations it has. Part of its limitation, it cannot prove certain things, such as, for example, mathematics or logic. Can science prove any of those? No, it can't. It can't prove metaphysical truths. So what is, that the world is real. So this is something metaphysical, because science only deals with physical things. It does not deal with metaphysical things. So reality cannot deal with that. Our minds are trustworthy. How can it prove that? It really can't. Now, the fourth thing I'm going to mention of why science cannot, is not the only source of knowledge, is that science itself depends on two other sources of knowledge. Logic and transmission or reports. Usually if you look at philosophy, they tell you there's 3 or 4. They're kind of argue sources of knowledge. Some people mention 5. But 3 sources of knowledge essentially are empiricism, empiric empiricism, which is essentially empirical data, which is science, your stimulus, your observations. The other one is logic. The third one is report, which is transmission. And the funny thing is, science without these two can never exist. Because anytime a paper references something, what is it doing? It's saying, okay, this scientist has published this, and he's saying that. Did I test it? No, I'm accepting it as a report. Now, isn't that a source of knowledge? Is that right? Anytime you see a picture, that's a report. Anytime somebody tells you something, anytime you read it, that's all a report because you never experienced it yourself, you never tested it. So this is a source of knowledge. But the other one is logic. Logic has to be used in making scientific conclusions. For example, the law of non-contradiction. Okay, law of non-contradiction, which means things cannot be, for example, both true. How should I rephrase this? So, law of contradiction is that contradictory propositions cannot be both true in the same sense. So things are contradictory, right? True and false. They cannot be the same at the same time. Is that clear? Now we use that in science, scientific data. Like this is how we figure something else, right? This is simple logic. But this is why I'm doing all these things. But anyway, in conclusion, I'm going to close this section over here. Generally speaking, because Darwinism belongs to the field of science, it naturally would not lead to certainty. Right? So all this I'm talking about, why? Because Darwinism, once again, is being propagated as a fact, as a truth, where in reality it can never be, because it can never be certain. Right? It will always be speculative. It's based on probabilities. It is the best fit model, the most likely, whatever the case is you want to mention it, but it never reaches certainty. Now, the second thing I want to talk about in this section over here of the state of Darwinism is things that are with the theory itself. Okay? Now, to the theory itself, we mentioned several assumptions. Okay? Almost all these assumptions, there are debates about them. The core concept that Darwinism is built on, there are debates about them. I'm gonna take only a few and talk about them. And so the question is, does evolution occur by gradual changes caused by random, undirected, beneficial genetic mutation resulting in novel functions? So I'm going to look at three things: gradual, beneficial, novel. Okay? That's the core of part of the core of Darwinism. So the first one, yes? I said what? It's a mechanism to explain evolution. Yes. I'm not contradicting, because I'm saying, so Darwinism is a mechanism of evolution. So it says evolution works this way. Okay? So that's all I said. This is what I'm saying. So as a model, does evolution occur, based on this model, does evolution occur by gradually, due to beneficial genetic mutations that result in novel new functions? Because that's the only way you're going to get complex new traits and all these things. So the first one I'm going to cover from different aspects of it. So the first one is gradual. Okay. So remember we said if there's gradual changes, you should be able to see transitional species. Is that right? Now I'm going to have to use quotes. I can't dive into all the fossil records, but I'm going to use quotes from different different scientists. And this is I'm going to quickly. This is referring to the fossils. So theoretically, once again, if change happens, if it's gradual, then you should be able to see fossil records of transitional organisms, going from one species to the next. If you want to use humans as an example, that is fine. Then from ape-like looking ancestors to hominids, something in the middle between the ape and the humans. Now, Stephen Gay Gould, who's an evolutionary paleontologist at Harvard University, he made a confession. and this was in Natural History, published in a paper in Natural History. He says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in fossil records persist as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Right? So this is one admission. Another leading paleoanthropologist, actually there's two of them, and they published a paper together. And the title of it is The Myth of Human Evolution. So this is Niles Eldridge and Ian Tertsel. So they said 120 years of paleontological research later, it has become abundantly clear that the fossil records will not conform this part of Darwinism's prediction. Okay, so that prediction cannot be fulfilled. So this has to do with the gradual aspect of it. Now, in terms of, I'm going to let this aside. Now I'm going to address the aspect of mutations. Do they lead to beneficial novel genes? Okay. What's interesting is that publications, now we know this, like when we do experiments generally, whenever anybody has a abnormality in their health or their physical system, it's usually due to a mutation. Is that right? And so does that lead to something beneficial? No. If you ever done some lab experiments with bacteria or yeast or any model organisms and you expose them to a mutagen, what happens to the majority of them? They survive or die? Die, which tells you the majority of mutations are not beneficial, right? It's the opposite. But I'm going to mention, once again, go back to several articles. There's a famous Linsky experiment. So he showed that the beneficial mutations he said the beneficial mutations may be as rare as 1 in a million. Okay, so the title of his article is Evolution in Action, a 50,000 generation salute to Charles Darwin. So this was published in Microbes, 2011. Batalon, another scientist, and he mentioned this in Hereditary, an article, in a journal called Hereditary. He states that in his paper that it is thought that beneficial mutations may be so rare that their rarity cannot be accurately measured. Nobel laureate Hermann Mueller was the first individual to kind of recognize this problem of bad mutations flowing into a population faster than they could be selected away. Which means that whenever you have, so essentially here's what's happening. Whenever mutations happen, you have three options. Either they're beneficial, they're neutral, or they're detrimental. Whatever the case is, over time they will accumulate. Yes? Okay, good. I'll get that in a second. But it's a good question, right? So, but first of all, sickle cell anemia, it is a mutation, right? Is it a defect or a normality? It's a defect, right? So it's something deleterious. Overall, yes, it did benefit in that one aspect. But once they move to another environment and that gene becomes homozygous in their children, what happens? It's not good, right? But even that individual who's heterozygous for it, they're unable to do any sort of physical activity very well because their oxygen cannot be delivered properly to their body, which means if they ever have to be, if something is running, they have to run to save their lives, will be able to do it. So overall, is it beneficial? Maybe for one aspect, but overall it is not. Right? But anyway, so this Nobel laureate, he kind of mentioned, what is the problem? He said bad mutations flowing in the population, they're faster than they are, which means that the mutations generally they accumulate over time. The majority of the time, 2 out of 3, it's either neutral or something deleterious, but it will be accumulating over time. The rate of bad accumulating is more than the beneficial. And this is why, for example, a paper by Orr in 2019, and another paper by a couple other authors in 2000, they say that essentially both of them, they kind of mention, says, contrary to popular belief, mutations are mostly harmful and many are attributed to causing genetic diseases. Okay. Now, even when we talk about experiments, so this is something I'm going to mention over here that has to do with whether we should think that they are deleterious or not. So experiments, even like some experiments have been done over 30 years long on bacteria. And so what they did was they took 12 separate identical populations of bacteria and they separated them and they exposed them to some sort of selection. And essentially what they wanted to see if they're going to be able to absorb citrate. Bacteria cannot absorb it. But what they did find is that essentially this population, they had undergone obviously millions of mutations and they surpassed in thousands of generations. The researchers, what they found was that out of all these, about one was able to absorb citrate. Okay? Now they'll say, look, this is proof of what? Is this advantageous or not? Yes? It can survive now in citrus, right? This is something that it was looking for, it was hoping for. So you can say it's advantageous. It's something sort of a novel gene, right? Something of a novel purpose. But what they're saying is what happened is that there's a mutation that happened in a transporter. So that gene was already there, it's just a mutation in the transporter, and so it's able to carry the citrate. And so they say at best, this experiment represents a form of macroevolution, okay? And essentially they're saying that I'm just going to pull the quote from the article. Hold on, I'm just going to find the article quickly. All right, so here's what they're saying. So they're saying that at best, this experiment represents a form of microevolution because it revolves around the idea of pre-existing gene information, a mutation that would have modified the DNA, not added to it. So there's no new addition, no novel formation or anything like that. So the authors of the articles, they believe that natural selection is can no longer be seen as a powerful driving force that optimizes mutations in real scenarios. So we're saying that it's kind of not easy to kind of form new novel things. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention about this whole thing about gradual and then changes is that the time frame that is required to move from one form, I'm going to use over here, there's a beautiful experiment that was published in Genetics, to change one molecule, right, of similar forms, to change it to be exactly like the other one in terms of function. So they have two different functions, but they look three-dimensionally the same, but they have different functions. And so when analyzed, so these authors, this was published in 2008 in Genetics, they analyzed, okay, so these are two genes in bacteria. It's called KBL1 and BIOF. And so they said, okay, how many mutations would it take to move from here to there? They figured out it's 7 mutations. Okay, to change the function of this into the function of that. That's not like a lot, because evolutionally they're thought to be connected ancestrally. So 7 mutations a lot? It's not very much, is it? Right? Now what they did was, so the title of the article is "Waiting for 2 Mutations with Applications to Regulatory Sequence Evolution and the Limit of Darwinian Evolution." So they're really showing the unrealistic time frame that it will take. And so what they found was that it would, for those 2 changes, for 7 changes, consecutive beneficial changes to occur, it will take 10 to the 27 to the power 27 years. Okay? How old is the world? The universe. How old is the universe? No, just the estimated scientific, the universe. How old is the universe? 14 is close enough, right? It's about 13.8 billion, which is approximately 10 to the power of 10. Now, these 7 changes will require a time frame of 10 to the power 27, which is twice the time frame it will take of this age of the entire universe. It will need twice or 2.5 times more. Now, this is just 7 changes. And so this tells you this idea of beneficial changes, consecutive built. It really does not apply very much. Okay? Now, I would like to end this section by a quote from Professor Dennis Noble. He's an evolutionary biologist in Oxford University. He says, all the central assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, I don't necessarily agree with him, but I'm just pointing out what some scientists are saying, and that Darwinism is not exactly a certainty. It's not a fact. It's not as being propagated in the media. It has assumptions. It has a whole lot of things that are being argued against. Now, the last part of the talk is really Islam's stance on Darwinism. Okay? The reason this is important is because a lot of the whole connection between Darwinism and atheism. Okay? Which brings a good question, actually. Can science disprove or prove God? Can science prove or disprove the existence of God? No. Why? Because it's not its field in the first place. Is that right? And this is something that is even scientists have mentioned. So, for example, Hugh Gauch, he says, so he's a senior researcher, specialist at Cornell University. So he says, to insist that science supports atheism is to get high marks for enthusiasm, but low marks for logic. All right? I like that quote. And Michael Bruce, he's a professor in philosophy, Florida State University. He says, science as such does not refute religion. But nonetheless, what is our stance? What is it, what's Islam's stance on Darwinism? How should we deal with it? The answer is really we deal with it the same way we deal with any scientific theory. It's as simple as that. If we put Darwinism in its proper place, in the epistemology of knowledge, that is something that is not certain, and that there's other sources of knowledge that we have, reports and transmission, and then knowledge which do lead to certainty, right? When something that is uncertain contradicts with certainty, should it bother us? Should it bother us at all? It shouldn't. Because we know science will change. It happens all the time, right? Previously, people had the theory of the universe. They thought it was a static state universe. What does that mean? It means what? It means, no, not just that. It means somebody said something here. Not just doesn't change. It's eternal, has no beginning. Okay? They held that idea for so long. As a Muslim, right, we know that the world had a beginning. Now, did that bother scientists at that time? Because now all of a sudden the science has changed. It has a new theory that, no, wait a second, the world does have a beginning. And they came up with the Big Bang Theory, right? Now, this is why I personally, for me, I don't get hung up very much on scientific findings, because I don't like using them as supportive evidence for religion, because eventually, sooner or later, what happens if they change? But in the end, this is something that is not certain, okay? It does not lead to certainty. We have other sources of knowledge that lead to certainty. So the way we deal with Darwinism is the same way we deal with, this is our position, with anything else. Yes, we do believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses physical causes to manifest His will and His power. This is why we're very happy. I'm as a scientist, I'm fine with using methodological naturalism, right? To try to explain the world around us based on our physical means, because these are the sunan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed. This is how things work. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. But would I extrapolate that and take it and start producing more of a paradigm of things that are metaphysical? Does God exist? Does not exist? No, I don't do that, right? This is not its place whatsoever. And so when conflict arises between the Quran and scientific conclusion, there's really no reason to panic. There shouldn't be, right? And we should never have our faith shaken, because once again, we have two other sources of knowledge that are certain. This is uncertain. We should never allow this to overtake the other. And so we should assume that scientific conclusions generally are true. They're not, we never assume that it's absolutely true in the sense that it will never change. We know that it will always change. So in summary, I guess we can say that we can accept scientific conclusions practically as a working model. So to be honest, the theory of Darwinism is a good model, right? It makes predictions. Yes, it might not make all the proper predictions, but it's the same as Newtonian physics, right? You cannot make all the predictions. You use it for whatever it's useful for, and then you might want to change or add or whatever the case is to the theory, but you can use it as a model. But if anything contradicts revelation, after attempting to reconcile both, then we do not have to accept a scientific conclusion into our belief system, right? So this is why Muslims should not need to deny Darwinistic evolution, right? The theory of Darwinistic mechanism of evolution. We don't need, we don't have to sit there and fight with it. Yes, if they take it and extrapolate and say, go out through history and say, listen, humans developed from this, this, and that. Well, the first question is, well, where's the proof? Okay. Now we can go into all these details later on, but in reality, even anthropologists or paleoanthropologists, they are debating among this. They can't see. They see fossils that are clearly human type, fossils that are clearly, ape-looking. And what's interesting is when they date these, or in some sites, they find that actually these human remains coexist with what they used to say are, ancestors. And if they are predecessors to them, they cannot exist in the same time. So there's a whole, this whole area is a bit of a mess. But they try to bring in genetics, but sometimes genetics doesn't help them. But anyways, this is our stance pretty much on it in terms of Darwinism. Now I apologize, there are a lot of things that I had to skim through. There's a lot of details, I'm sure there's questions. But once again, you can talk about this from very many different aspects. We can take each assumption and discuss it scientifically, philosophically, all these things. But this was, once again, an overview. The point of it is kind of just make us comfortable with this, not allow our faith to kind of be shaken by it, and to put it in its proper position, and to understand really the difference between how, secular scholars, scientists, actually in the field discuss things as opposed to being propagated in the public realm. By that, I think I'm going to stop here because I think we only have 15 minutes. Is that right? You guys pray at 9:30? All right, so we have 15. So I'll if you guys have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them. There will be no counseling after this. Yes, Sheikh. Hold on, just give me a second, Sheikh. Why what? Why am I Darwinist? I'm not a Darwinist. I didn't say I believe in it. I say I have no problems using it as a working model. Yes. So the thing with models, and I didn't mention this because I really don't want to go into the problem with interpreting data and the biases, because yes, he has a point. Quite often when you have a previous position that you're taking, it does affect how you read the data, right? But this has nothing to do with what I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm a Darwinist, that the only, that it's true, that it's a fact, that the world works by it. I'm saying I have no problem using it as a working model. Like me in the lab, for example, I use it in the lab, right? So the idea of, mutation and selection, when I do research and in my model organisms, I mutate them, I select for different things. So I use that model in my research, right? But do I take it as a belief system? Absolutely not. Right? Yes. So he used logic. He did not use science. He used logic. That's different. Because remember we said there's different ways to attain truth. Right? You got raw logic, reports, and your surrounding your stimulus. I'm going to add a kind of like a footnote to, yes, you cannot prove the existence of God, but science can indicate, can infer, right, that there's the chances of something not being directed is very low. And so something has to direct it, right? So it can infer the existence of God. Right? Yes?
Can you elaborate more on exactly what does evolution mean in the scientific sense? Because as a Muslim, can we say that we accept evolution?
Evolution as a term just means change. It just means change. Well, you have to be very specific. Now, this is very loaded, right? Because now you're going to have to ask a bit more details. Well, what do you mean by evolution? Do we accept that typical picture of the marching band from ape to human being, which by the way is completely false. Even modern scientists tell you this is not true. There's common ancestry. But is that what you mean? Does it include both micro and macro evolution? Right? Is that what you're talking about? But even I'll tell you this. If a person, because the only thing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us about creation is the creation of Adam. Is that right? Did He tell us about the creation, how everything else was created? No. Did He? No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not tell us how everything. He told us that He created Adam directly. Is that right? Did He tell us how He created the plant? Sorry? That is true. But didn't He say, وَالَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, right? يُولِجُ اللَّيْلَ فِي النَّهَارِ. And then another verse, He took 4 days to establish things. And so there is a system that's going on, right? Na? أَنزَلَ فِيهَا أَقْوَاتَهَا, right? That's true. And so, but He didn't tell us that He created it directly like He created Adam. Is that right? So, is it possible that all these other organisms developed from other ancestors? Possible. Is it a true fact? How can we say yes? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. He did not tell us. We cannot definitively say yes. So does it affect a person's belief if he adopts, other things that might, they might have other ancestors? Would it affect him as a Muslim in terms of their belief? I would say not really. The only contention you'd have or you should worry about is if he adopts that Adam alayhi salam, right, and Hawa are originated from a chain of previous ancestors, right? That goes against the direct, statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is an issue, yes. Okay, so talking, for example, about... Okay, I don't want to go into this, to be honest. So Lucy, for example, and Aldi, and all these things that they call intermediary, they have even like the paleontological scholars actually, at a closer look later on, they start arguing, what are you talking about? Okay, you have to remember, sometimes this is where the mindset of the individual comes into play. Sometimes because we want to believe something so much, we start looking very hard for things, okay, and then maybe ignore the larger picture. But the reality is, almost all these that they find will either belong one or two groups, nothing in the middle, right? Either ape-like or human-like, right? That's it. And the ones that have, but also the problem is when they find these things, they're not exactly complete bones or complete structure of everything. For example, one of them, they just find a jaw. And so from the jaw, they'll say, oh, look, intermediate. Well, in reality, what if it was a deformity? Right? If you analyze even the humans right now, if you analyze their skull structure, sometimes some genetic deformity can drastically change the skull of an individual, right? And when you can compare them, you'd think that this is an intermediate between this, and it's not, okay? But all these, like Lucy and all these intermediates, in reality, they have a whole lot of issues with them. Is one, they find some areas later on that humans did coexist with that specific type, right? Two, the time frame is drastically not the same. Right, so they assume the specific time frame. It seems that the time frame is off. Three, even the dating method that they use is very variable. Right, and there's a whole lot of other arguments. This is actually a good book, Contested Bones. Right, it kind of dives into that a little bit. So if you ever are able to get this book, I was kind of reading it on the airport, while traveling. It's kind of nice. But be careful, the authors, they prescribe to a specific view. So just be careful when you're going through it. So if you're a scientist, you should be able to kind of discern, or a biologist, be able to kind of discern through the data and figure it out. But a lot of the things that actually, I kind of enjoyed reading this book. It's called Contested Bones. It addresses this whole issue. But if you actually read the articles, even in the paleontologists or paleoanthropology, you'll find that they debate this stuff. So really, it's not definitive. But even I kind of quoted, several scholars that tell you that you can actually find that link. They're kind of almost dry. You can only have this type and that type, and anything they call intermediate. Quite often, papers have been published using genetics. They kind of showed actually no, they're kind of humans, but due to interbreeding and accumulated mutations, they have these severe defects in their structure, in their bones, their heights, whatever the case is. And so that can address some of these variations. Yes? That is not true. I'll tell you why. So when they analyzed the genetic material, some of these bones, they found that they had very intensive incest interbreeding between them. Okay? You know sometimes why they tell you don't marry your cousin? Why do they say that? Excellent. Now, these are a group of individuals that are isolated now. Okay? There's extensive interbreeding. Extensive over, we're talking about, hundreds of years. Eventually, yes, it does cause that. And I'm not saying this. If you want, I can pull out the science articles for you. I'm quoting it directly from published articles. There's 2 or 3 that mention that they look at some of these fossil records that initially they thought in the middle, and then when they analyze the DNA, they're like, wait a second, these are actually human DNA, right, from the humanoids. However, these deformities, we picked up that there's genetic mutations in these genes, these genes, these genes, these genes, these genes. Okay. There's actually an interesting picture that I saw. I can't remember where I saw it. The tallest human man, tallest human, right, in history, which was about 8 feet something, okay? And he was standing beside the shortest man ever, who's about this tall. Now, if I ever, in 100 years, analyze the bone structure of these two, what am I going to say? I'm just giving you an example, right? This height is not normal. There's a mutation there, right? And this height is not normal. There's a mutation. That affects their bone structure, the length, the shape, everything about it. If I see these two in different places without dating them, when I look at them, what am I going to say? You see what I mean? I'm just giving you a live example. But that aspect of interbreeding mutations sometimes causes actions. It does. It was proven in 2 or 3 articles, actually. I remember 2, but I think there's potentially a third one. But in the end, I quoted 4 different articles that tell you we have no intermediary findings between this and that. Right? So based on that, how can you make a conclusion? But also, let me tell you something. A lot of these things are based on what is called the homology, right? So they say, look, they have common ancestry because they're homologous. Homologous, which means that they're the same. They have same features, right? Things are similar, whether it's in the physical form or in the genetic or molecular. They say, listen, they're homologous, which means that they are connected. Well, how do you know they're connected? Well, because they're homologous, right? It's a circular argument. That's a bit of an issue. Homology in itself does not indicate common ancestry, because sometimes you can end up having the same thing from different roots. So this is called homeoplasy, right? So homeoplasy, which means sometimes features are developed from things that are not considered from the same ancestry, but if you look at them, whether physiologically or even genetically, they arrived there through different, so they're divergent, right? They find that even in archaeology. For example, the placental saber-tooth and the marsupial saber-tooth. If you ever look at them, they look exactly the same. Everything about them is the same, right? But when they analyze their DNA, right, they realize that it actually came from 2 different distant things. One of them is closer to a kangaroo than anything else. But even at the molecular level, they had found that there are genes in bats and dolphins, for example, right? They both use the ecosystem. There's a specific gene that is very similar between them that allows this, but they tell you, yes, it's the same sequence, but it seems that these different organisms arrived at them in different ways. So similarity does not indicate common ancestry. That's an assumption that they cannot prove. Right? Yes? Yes. No. Because you're assuming that they still have, lineage until this day. That's what you're assuming, right? Well, it's called maskh, right? And essentially, the scholars say when a nation, a maskh happens to them, they don't propagate. It's just that generation and it dies off, right? But then again, it's an assumption we have no proof for, right? To say that they exist until this day. Yes? All right. So this is, okay, so part of the Darwinistic theory, how he developed this theory of common ancestry, he says that similarity, right, indicate common ancestry. Well, that's an assumption. What is the evidence for that assumption? It's an assumption, right? Even modern scientists, they tell you not necessarily, because you can go into the circle of arguments, where they say, if they're similar, similarity indicates common ancestry. Well, how do you know they have common ancestry? Well, because they have similar features, right? Not necessarily. One thing they can come from divergent things.
Yes? So essentially, just what books would you recommend on the topic? Maybe more introductory for somebody who doesn't have a science background, and if possible, from an Islamic author.
Very tough question. Actually, you know what? There's a book that comes to mind. Well, what are you looking for exactly? What topic?
I mean, just for example, the one that we spoke about today, maybe just evolution, Darwinism, and Islam critique, such a book exists.
Well, there's one book that talks about science generally, which would be beneficial. Science, just talks about, there's a chapter in science. Talk to me, I'm going to pull its name, I can't, it's slipped my mind right now. And it's a really good book. Right? It's an entire, he wrote this book, he was a Christian, or was he an atheist? He's from a Greek background, and he became a Muslim. He's in England. And, sorry, what's his name? Yes? Good, Hamza Fatias. Do you know his book? Slipped my mind. He has a really good book that addresses aspects of that. And he talks about the science, chapter of science. There's a YouTube channel by another brother who's also in England, who his channel is dedicated for Darwinism. You can watch the YouTube videos.
Do you know the name?
I think it's called Darwinian Delusions. Talk to me after I confirm this. I think it's called Darwinian Delusions. If I remember correctly. Now this is being recorded, please edit this out because I'm not quite sure of the name. But I think that's what it's called. You have to be, because you're going to have to, when you read into this, to be honest, you have to be there's other sciences you need to kind of learn a little bit ahead of time, right? So a little bit of philosophy, especially epistemology, some of the arguments, and then a bit of a science background, and then a bit more rooted into Islamic studies, and then you can kind of dive into that. But those two are really good in those two things. I think your time.
Just re-announce the program.
All right, so I'm re-announcing this, inshallah. So this is Zidni Islamic Institute. So they have a beautiful 1-year introduction, like a 1-year program. It's Introduction to Islamic Sciences. It's like a pilot program. It's about 17 different things that you're taking, whether it's from the Quran, from fiqh, from sciences of hadith, from fiqh, from languages. It is quite good, mashallah. If you want to register for it, register because there are actually limited seats, if I understand correctly. There's limited seats. Limited seats, inshallah. I do highly encourage you to register, inshallah, if you can. Was that? No?
Well, Sheikh Omar comes here. First of all, I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Ahmed, for his beautiful lecture coming all the way from the East Coast. I also want to mention something. While Dr. Ahmed spoke about the issue of proving God and science, there is a discussion when it comes to philosophy, dialectics, logic, where you can prove the existence of God through logic. When you're speaking with a non-Muslim or debating a non-Muslim, you do not agree on the same sources. They're not going to agree in the Quran and the Sunnah for you to say, well, the Quran says this and this and this. You have to discuss from a perspective that they agree with you on. And so from that perspective, it would be logic, philosophy, and the like. So inshallah, hopefully in the future, we can do a workshop, a dawrah, speaking about the logical, philosophical proofs, the undeniable, logical, philosophical proofs of the existence of a creator, and that creator having to be eternal, and that eternal creator having to have certain attributes, such as the ability to create, the ability to have ultimate knowledge and power, and so on, until you can convince your person that you're debating or your opponent that there is no other logical explanation for our existence. So inshallah, we will announce that in the future, but this was a first good start, talking about first from a scientific perspective that science cannot disprove the existence of God, and then this is how we do prove the existence of God with a common background of logic and philosophy. So inshallah, we'll look out for that announcement soon, inshallah. Again, we thank Dr. Ahmed for the very beautiful lecture. We are teaching a 1-year Islamic studies program, as the Sheikh mentioned, in Sacramento every other weekend intensives. You can also do it online if the spaces are limited. We encourage everyone to sign up. We're starting in 1 week, so please go visit the website and register if you're interested. Barakallahu feekum. Hada wa sallallahu alaihi wa sallam.